that this entire idea of climate justice, not just climate change, but understanding climate change from an environmental justice, from a social justice, from a racial and economic justice perspective, as well as from a human rights perspective and Indigenous rights perspective as well, has been one of the key contributions of Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities across Canada, but across the world. And that's really what I think that one of the main ideas behind this session is about. And so in my own work, I've worked a lot with the Indigenous Environmental Network, as well as helped to found an organization in Canada called the Canadian Youth Climate Coalition. And my recent studies at Carleton University, my thesis focused on how Indigenous peoples have been working to really decolonize, to really challenge the dominant institutions, organizations, as well as discourses around climate change, and really trying to contribute with their own knowledge. And I've also spent time actually working with a number of Indigenous communities in different parts of the world, in different parts of Canada, the US, but also mostly focusing on Latin America as well. But in particular, with reference to Canada, I think it bears notice mentioning that Canada really started off as what we talk about as Canada, as a colonial creation by the French, by the British, as a resource base. On the one hand, for furs, trees, and a lot of other natural resources. And then what we're seeing sort of today is that in a lot of ways Canada's returning to that resource-based model. Canada's returning to becoming a colonial country that has based its economy on resources. And no longer in a small scale, but on a massive scale that threatens widespread social, environmental, and human rights costs. And not just in Canada as well, but really trying to expand its territories over other parts of the world, including places like the Amazon, where Canadian mining companies and oil companies and forestry companies are going in now and threatening the lives of Native peoples in those places, some of the last and most untouched areas of the world. And so as a colonial power, a lot of its founding sort of logic of Canada was based on the subjugation of nature and the subjugation of Native peoples in a combined way. And again, Canada's returning to that model in the pursuit of extracting those resources that have somehow now ended up under Native control and on Native lands. And I think in Canada, the best sort of example that we have of this is looking at the tar sands in northern Alberta. And the tar sands really represent one of the most sort of gregarious developments taking place in Canada and in any part of the world really at this time. It's a development that's taking place over an area the size of England, if you can imagine that, in northern Alberta, where they basically have to deforest vast areas, as you can see on the bottom left, of pristine boreal forest, one of the biggest ecosystems we have on this planet, and turn it often into virtual moonscapes, as you see on the right, as the mining companies, the oil companies, dig down hundreds and hundreds of feet below the ground to gain access to the oil that's below. And that's because it's not like traditional types of oil. It's not like traditional things where you just put a straw in the ground and up comes the oil. This one is kind of like mixed with sand and with clay. And so they have to really dig down really, really deep and basically take it out one layer at a time from the ground. And so what ends up happening in this process that's extremely energy intensive, that's extremely water intensive, is that you end up creating a lot of pollution. You end up using a lot of chemicals, you end up releasing a lot of toxins into the air, into the ground, into the soil. And for Canada, for the Alberta government, this isn't much of a concern because, in their minds, the only people who are living out here are Native people. And what ends up happening is that you have one of the biggest sources of pollution in the entire country, actually the biggest single source point of pollution in the entire country, that ends up leaking its water, its toxic tailings, into Lake Athabasca and up the Athabasca River, and passing by a number of Native communities, particularly Dene, Chipewyan, and Métis communities along the way. who all lie downstream from what is the biggest industrial development in Canada. And you also end up with a number of extreme health impacts in a lot of these communities because of these toxins. Communities are starting to see incredible amounts of diseases and rare cancers that have never been before seen in their communities. But at the same time, they're also starting to see really unusual transformations in a lot of the fish and wildlife in the area. And some of the government's own documents, some of the companies' own documents confirm that there are toxin levels between 30 and 300 times the legal limits being found in some of their catches of moose, fish, beaver, a lot of the traditional substances that these communities depend upon. And I should also mention that this is, you can see up there, it's Fort McMurray. That's where the main activity is centered on tar sands. It's a few hundred kilometers north of Edmonton. And even further beyond that is the community of Fort Chippeway. And Fort Chippeway in particular is a flying community. There's no all year round road. And so this is a community that depends most times of the year, about 80% on traditional resources, on traditional substance, trapping, hunting, and fishing to provide food for everybody. What this map is trying to express is that the impacts aren't localized to that part of northern Alberta. Because of the massive amounts of energy involved, what they want to do is actually build this Mackenzie Valley pipeline, which was shelved in the 70s due to Native objections and Native rights concerns. They actually are looking to actually push through with that and actually start building offshore drilling in the Arctic Ocean. Thanks to climate change, I guess, now that we have that opened up. The other big thing they want to do is start building nuclear power plants to actually start powering these tar sands developments, which is just crazy. And they haven't, built nuclear power reactors in a long time in Canada, but everything's on the table right now as Canada returns to this model of doing anything to appease this economic engine. The last sort of impact is you see all these purple lines that spread pretty much everywhere across the island, across North America. And these are the pipelines, another infrastructure that they want to build, including factories, refineries, and upgraders. And the dotted lines represent pipelines that they want to build that would go to northern BC, that would extend all the way across the prairies and feed back up into Quebec and Ontario, but also head all the way down to Texas and out to the eastern seaboard of the US. And particularly in northern British Columbia, there's been an alliance of First Nations communities that have been formed to oppose the construction of this pipeline. We're going to actually see a little movie on this later on in the day. But understanding that there's widespread environmental concerns, widespread concerns about the viability of these communities if there's ever to be an oil spill, but also the disruption to their traditional way of life caused by building some of the biggest pipelines out to a sort of seaport that would be basically shipping oil the same way as Exxon Valdez was when it crashed. So understanding that this is what Canada is really getting into, we really understand that Canada's returned to this resource dependency model and is really relying on a systematic destruction of native communities as well as the natural world to achieve that. And so a little bit of background on climate change and how climate change has emerged as an issue. For most people, it emerged as an issue back in 1997 when the Kyoto Protocol was signed as the first sort of international legislation on climate change. During those negotiations, Canada decided to basically take on the US policy and improve it by 1%. Literally, they promised 1% more reductions than the US did. And over periods since 1997 to now, they haven't done any of that, any of those reductions. They haven't taken any of those pledges seriously. And what we're seeing is that basically Canada has reneged on all of their agreements and basically said they're going to stand in violation of international law, but also their moral obligations to the world community on dealing with this issue. Fast forward to 2009, last year, we had the Copenhagen Accord signed in Copenhagen, Denmark, where the climate change negotiations are taking place. And there, at those negotiations, Canada even lost all pretense of talking big, like it did in Kyoto. And at those negotiations, Canada basically was laid out by other countries and civil society groups and Indigenous groups around the world as being the worst country in those negotiations, the worst offender. And not just because it stood up there and said that we're not going to allow for any countries to make pledges, any countries to make any drastic cuts on climate change, but also because they were opposed to having any sort of language about Indigenous rights. And we'll get into that a little bit more. But these international agreements, this international talk, has really been dominated forever by countries like Canada, by countries in Europe, by the US, all countries with very sort of Eurocentric lineages and very state-dominated ways of viewing the world system. And as a result of that, we see that the rights of minorities and the rights of other peoples around the world have been constantly subjugated to these states. First Indigenous groups that went to the international level were actually my ancestors, a man by the name of Skahe Kayugaman, actually traveled to the League of Nations back in 1924 and was sort of barred from doing sort of effective work there by the colonial powers at the time. The next sort of phase in sort of Indigenous peoples going into the international level happened again in the 70s. And my dad was actually a big part of that when the Iroquois delegation and a number of other Indigenous delegations from around the world actually traveled to Geneva, traveled to the United Nations, human rights committees, and made their case for understanding Indigenous peoples as having fundamental human rights and rights that have never been given up. As a result of those negotiations, as a result of all the work that was been done over the years at the UN, we ended up in 2007 with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it's a very important sort of declaration that lays out in an international law and an international legal framework the rights of Indigenous communities. It's not the document that confers those rights, but it affirms them and recognizes them. And it recognizes that they've always existed and they will always exist. And so that's important for international law and things like when we look at international legislation on things like climate change, to make sure that they follow human rights legislation, that they don't violate people's rights around the world. And it's also important to recognize that this Indigenous rights regime has come in a lot of ways to challenge the dominant human rights regimes by challenging a lot of its assumptions, by challenging the individualistic nature of most human rights, by challenging the fact that in sort of the Western world, a lot of our rights are based on property rights, and versus Indigenous rights, which are based on more collective rights.